The first sign that my life was a lie wasn't a scream or a shatter of glass. It was the soft, sickening pat of my own hands against my empty purse at the airline check-in counter. No passport. The word echoed in my skull, a flat, stupid thud against the cheerful chaos of the Miami-bound travelers at SeaTac. For 66 years, I had been Evelyn Parker, the woman who never forgot anything. The woman who laminated checklists for camping trips and kept birth certificates in a fireproof safe. But today, on the precipice of the first real adventure of my widowed life, a solo Mediterranean cruise I had saved for, and dreamed of for 2 years, I was just a fool who'd left the single most important document, sitting on the hall table in her quiet craftsman home in Tacoma. The drive back was a blur of self-reproach and adrenaline. Every red light felt like a personal insult, every slow driver a saboteur of my meticulously planned independence. I could feel the ship pulling away from the dock in Miami without me, the sun glinting off a sea I would never get to sail. This trip was more than a vacation, it was a declaration. It was me telling the world, and myself, that I was still here after losing Bob. That his quiet, steady presence hadn't been the only thing holding my world together. Now, my own carelessness threatened to undo it all. I pulled into the driveway, my tires crunching on the familiar gravel, and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and profound. I decided not to use the front door. No need to announce my failure to Grace and Derek. My daughter and her husband were supposed to be watching the house, a simple task of watering the prize-winning roses Bob had planted and collecting the mail. I slipped in through the side door to the mudroom, my sneakers making no sound on the worn linoleum. My plan was simple: grab the passport from the mahogany hall table, where I could now picture it perfectly, and flee back to the airport, shamefaced but successful. But then I heard their voices. They were floating in from the backyard through the open kitchen window, carried on the scent of freshly cut grass and the sweet perfume of the climbing jasmine Bob had coaxed into life. They sounded relaxed. Happy, even. The casual clinking of ice in glasses punctuated their words. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob to the main house. It has to look natural, Grace. We can't just rush it. Derek's voice was smooth, reasonable. It was the same tone he used when explaining stock options or why I should invest in some tech company I'd never heard of. She could live another 10, 15 years. We can't wait that long. The market is perfect now. Wait for what? The market for what? Grace's voice was softer, laced with a familiar, flimsy hesitation. I know, but starting the process while she's on this trip feels ghoulish. It's not ghoulish, it's strategic. Derek countered, his voice losing a fraction of its patience. This cruise is the perfect Exhibit A. Mother is gallivanting around Europe, forgetting her responsibilities, making impulsive decisions. It all feeds the narrative. We just need Dr. Ramirez to document a few lapses when she gets back. It's for her own good. To protect her from herself. My blood didn't just run cold, it turned to slush in my veins. My breath hitched in my throat, silent. I was paralyzed in the dim, quiet mudroom, listening to the methodical, calm dismantling of my life. My own daughter, my son-in-law, they weren't house-sitting. They were circling. This wasn't about concern. This was about control. They wanted my assets. They wanted my home. They wanted to strip me of my own mind, my own choices, and they were using my first act of joy since my husband's death as the weapon to do it. The cruelty of it was so absolute, so breathtaking, it felt like something out of a movie. A story you hear about happening to someone else, a cautionary tale that makes you shake your head in disbelief. But before we continue, make sure you've subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We're really happy to know that our stories have reached people everywhere. And my story, I realized in that horrifying, endless moment, was just beginning. Derek was still talking, scripting Grace's role in the coming performance. You just have to sound worried. Tell the neighbors you've been noticing little things. Tell your friends at church she seems confused. We're not the villains here, honey. We're the responsible children stepping in before she gives it all away or burns the house down. My house. The house Bob and I had poured 30 years of love and labor into. The house where we raised our daughter. They weren't talking about a building, they were talking about liquidating my entire existence. My fingers, numb and stiff, curled into fists. The passport on the hall table suddenly seemed insignificant. The cruise ship could sail to the edge of the world and fall off for all I cared. In that small, dusty mudroom, with the scent of my husband's roses drifting through the window, I had just discovered a far more urgent destination, a fight for my life. And the two people I had trusted most in the world were the enemy. The sound of their laughter, a light and carefree thing from the backyard, finally broke the paralysis. It was the sound of predators, full and satisfied after a kill they hadn't even made yet. I didn't move from the mudroom. I couldn't. My body was a statue of ice and fury, but my mind was a raging wildfire, tearing through the landscape of my life, illuminating everything their greed threatened to burn to the ground. This wasn't just about money. Oh, they wanted the money, of course. But what they were planning to take was so much more than that. They were planning to steal my very history, the world that Bob and I had built with our bare hands and our steady hearts. Bob. His face materialized in the dim light of the mudroom, as clear as if he were standing beside me. Not the tired, pain-etched face from his final days, but the one I held in my heart, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. The faint scent of sawdust that always clung to his flannel shirts, the solid feel of his hand in mine. We were simple people. 2 public school careers spanning 3 decades. I taught 3rd grade. He was the high school guidance counselor. We weren't flashy. We didn't take lavish vacations or drive German cars. Our wealth wasn't in our portfolio, it was in the foundation of our lives. It was in the very walls of this house. This house. My gaze drifted from the mudroom door to the kitchen beyond. I could see the faint outline of the butcher block island Bob had built for me one anniversary. He'd spent a month in the garage, sanding and planing, and when he brought it in, his face was alight with a pride that had nothing to do with money. Every scuff on the hardwood floors told a story, the deep gouge near the hearth from when a 5-year-old Grace had tried to ride her tricycle inside, the water ring on the windowsill where I'd forgotten a potted geranium for too long. We hadn't just bought this house, we had infused it with our lives. We held a mortgage-burning party in the backyard when we made the final payment 10 years ago. It was a joke to some of our friends, a relic from our parents' generation. But to us, it was a sacrament. Bob had held the last statement over the barbecue grill, a ceremonial flame, and his grin was wider than I'd ever seen it. "We own it, Ev," he'd whispered to me later that night. "All of it. No one can ever take it from us." Oh, Bobby. How wrong you were. They wanted to sell it. Derek's words echoed again. The market is perfect now. As if it were just a commodity. A collection of boards and wires and plumbing to be flipped for a profit. They didn't see the pencil marks on the pantry doorframe, charting Grace's height from a wobbly toddler to a young woman who towered over me. They didn't see the ghost of Bob in his worn leather armchair by the fire, reading the paper, his feet up on the ottoman. To them, this wasn't a sanctuary. It was inventory. And then there were the numbers, the cold, hard figures they were so eager to control. We had been meticulous. Our life was a testament to the quiet discipline of compounding interest and living below our means. The 401 KS from the school district, the IRAs we funded every single year without fail, the modest portfolio of mutual funds Bob managed with the steady hand of a farmer tending his crops. It wasn't a fortune, not by the standards of Derek's world of leveraged buyouts and speculative ventures. But it was our future. It was the nest egg that was supposed to see me through my remaining years with dignity, not dependence. It was the fruit of 1,000 small sacrifices, packing lunches instead of buying, mending clothes instead of replacing, driving the same reliable Toyota for 15 years. I thought of the neat manila folders in Bob's filing cabinet. Each one precisely labeled. Each statement filed in chronological order. We had built that security together, a bulwark against the chaos of the world. And Grace and Derek were planning to stroll in, not with a battering ram, but with a key and a pen, using fabricated concerns and forged signatures to claim it all. They wanted to seize the harvest another man had sown. Beyond the money, beyond the house, was our name. Our reputation. On this quiet Tacoma block, we were the Parkers. We were the ones who always shoveled our walk first, who brought soup over when a neighbor was sick, who organized the annual block party. A spotless reputation, built not through grand gestures but through a lifetime of small, decent acts. And now, my own daughter was preparing to poison that well, to walk through our community, planting seeds of doubt about my mind. She would prime them to see senility in a forgotten name, dementia in a misplaced set of keys. She would turn my friends, my neighbors of 20 years, into unwitting spies, their sympathetic glances becoming daggers of judgment. The thought was a physical violation, a stain spreading over the clean, orderly fabric of my life. This cruise. It was meant to be the antithesis of all that. It was my first, defiant step out of the gray fog of grief that had enveloped me since Bob's passing. For a year, I had been a ghost in my own home, surrounded by his absence. The silence was a constant companion. Then one day, sorting through his desk, I found a travel brochure for the Greek Isles tucked into a book. It was a trip we had always talked about taking someday. That someday had been stolen from us. But as I looked at the impossibly blue water and whitewashed villages, a tiny spark flickered to life inside me. I could go. For him. For me. Booking that cruise was the first decision I had made entirely for myself in years. It felt like breathing again after holding my breath for too long. I spent weeks planning, reading history books, buying new sandals. The trip wasn't an escape, it was a reclamation. It was me, Evelyn Parker, choosing joy. Choosing life. It was my declaration of independence. And they were twisting it into evidence of my incompetence. My gallivanting. My impulsiveness. The words were a bitter acid in my mouth. They were turning my strength into a weakness, my healing into a sickness. It was a breathtakingly evil strategy, all the more so for its cool, calculated precision. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a corporate takeover of a human soul. I leaned my head back against the cool wood of the mudroom wall, the chill seeping into my skull. The stakes were suddenly, terrifyingly clear, laid out like items on an auction block. For sale, one paid-off craftsman home, filled with memories. For sale, a lifetime of careful savings, meant for a secure old age. For sale, the good name of a woman in her community. For sale, her dignity. Her autonomy. Her right to choose her own path. The price for all of it. My freedom. My very identity. They weren't just planning to steal from me. They were planning to erase me, to reduce Evelyn Parker, a wife, a mother, a teacher, a friend, a woman on the verge of rediscovering her own life, into a ward of the state, a signature on a power of attorney form, a monthly expense to be managed. The ice in my veins began to melt, replaced by a slow, rising heat. The ship in Miami, the forgotten passport, the frantic rush, it all felt like it had happened a lifetime ago, to a different woman. That woman was naive. That woman was trusting. That woman believed that family was a safe harbor. I stood here now, in the quiet shadows of my own home, and knew that harbor was filled with sharks. My grief for Bob was a clean, sharp pain. This betrayal was a spreading poison. It wasn't just my money at risk. It was my legacy. It wasn't just my house. It was my home. It wasn't just my trip. It was my future. And I would not let them take it. Not without a fight. The question was no longer if the ship would sail without me, but what I would do before it ever returned to port. I remained in the shadows of the mudroom, a ghost in my own home, as their voices continued to drift in from the sun-drenched yard. The initial shock, that raw, physical blow to the chest was beginning to subside, replaced by a terrifying clarity. It was like watching surgeons discuss a vivisection, their language clinical and detached, their subject completely alive and aware on the table. My life was on that table. The legal term is a conservatorship, Derek explained, and the word itself sounded sterile, bureaucratic, and utterly suffocating. He pronounced it with a certain relish, as if he'd been practicing. In some states they call it guardianship. It's a court order. We petition a judge, present our evidence, and they grant us grant you, as the daughter the legal authority to manage her affairs. A judge? Grace's voice was thin, reedy. The voice of a child seeking reassurance that the monster under the bed wasn't real. But what about Daddy's lawyer? Mr. Henderson. He set up the will, the trust. Wouldn't he? Derek let out a short, dismissive laugh. It was a sound I'd heard before, usually directed at a waiter who'd brought the wrong wine or a contractor who'd missed a deadline. It was the sound of contempt for anyone not as clever as he was. Henderson is old school, honey. He works for her. We need someone who works for us. The point isn't to follow her existing plan, the point is to supersede it. We argue that she is no longer competent to manage her own affairs, that her estate plan, made when she was of sound mind, no longer reflects the reality of her current cognitive state. Cognitive state. The phrase was an insult wrapped in jargon. He was talking about my mind. My thoughts. The very essence of me. But she is competent, Grace whispered, and for a fleeting, desperate second, a flicker of hope ignited in my chest. There you are, Grace. There's my daughter. The hope died as quickly as it came. Is she? Derek's voice was a silken thread of poison. She's taking this trip, alone, at 66. Impulsive. She forgets things all the time, you've said so yourself. We just need to formalize it. Document it. We'll get Dr. Ramirez on board. A friendly physician's note goes a long way with a judge. Ramirez will recommend a full evaluation with a specialist, one we've already vetted, of course. It's a process. A game of chess. And we're already 3 moves ahead. I felt my stomach clench. Dr. Ramirez. Our family doctor for 20 years. A kind, gentle woman who had held my hand when Bob got his diagnosis. They were going to corrupt her, too. Turn her concern into a weapon. But what if the judge says no? Grace asked, her anxiety palpable. Then came the words that stopped my heart. He won't, not if we build the case right, Derek said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, almost intimate tone. Look, Grace, the reality is this. Your mother is healthy. Annoyingly so. She could easily live another 10, 15 years. We can't wait. The house is at peak value now. The market could turn. Her portfolio needs active management, not just sitting in those boomer mutual funds your dad set up. By the time she's gone, the opportunities could be gone, too. This isn't about taking her money. It's about protecting our inheritance from her inaction. 10. 15. Years. He said it like a prison sentence. My remaining years on this earth were an inconvenience. A roadblock on his path to financial glory. He was annoyed that I had the audacity to keep on living. The sheer, naked greed of it was almost elegant in its simplicity. He wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows, he was a businessman optimizing an asset. And I was the asset. My life was the variable he needed to control. He was scripting her now, his voice taking on the patient, slightly patronizing tone of a director coaching a nervous actress. So when you talk to people, you don't say, we're taking over. You say, I'm so worried about Mom. You sound sad. Overwhelmed. You tell them, she booked this crazy trip to Europe without really thinking it through, and I'm terrified she'll get lost or hurt. You see? You're the hero. You're the dutiful daughter, stepping in to save her flighty, aging mother from herself. I could picture Grace perfectly, her brow furrowed, nodding along, absorbing the script. She was always a people pleaser, desperate for approval, first from me and Bob, and now, completely and utterly, from this man who was methodically teaching her how to betray her own mother. The wavering in her voice wasn't moral conflict, it was fear of failure, fear of not playing her part convincingly enough. "And the house?" she asked, her voice a little stronger now, latching onto the concrete prize. "Once we have the conservatorship, we have the authority to make all financial decisions in her best interest," Derek said smoothly. "And her best interest, obviously, is to liquidate illiquid assets and move her into a more appropriate living situation. Someplace secure, where she can be monitored. A home." He meant a nursing home. They were going to sell my house, the sanctuary Bob and I built, and use the proceeds to put me in a cage. A clean, well-lit, expensive cage, I was sure, but a cage nonetheless. A place where I would be stripped of my keys, my car, my choices, my life. All while they lived in a new, bigger house, financed by my own. The symmetry of it was diabolical. I heard the scraping of a chair. "Let's go inside," Derek said. "I'll pour us another one. We can start drafting that letter to Dr. Ramirez." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my rage. I couldn't be found here. Not now. My only advantage, my only weapon, was the one thing they didn't know I had, the truth. If they saw me, the game would change. They would deny everything, gaslight me, and accelerate their plans with a vengeance. My body, which had been frozen for what felt like an eternity, finally obeyed. Silent as a cat, I backed away from the kitchen door, retreating deeper into the mudroom. My hand found the doorknob to the side yard. I turned it with excruciating slowness, the latch making a faint, oily click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in my own ears. I slipped outside, pulling the door shut until it was barely ajar, and flattened myself against the cool, shaded siding of the house. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I heard the back patio slider open and then close. I heard their footsteps in the kitchen, the clink of the ice dispenser from the refrigerator Bob and I had picked out together. They were inside now. Inside my house, plotting its demise. I stayed pressed against the wall, taking slow, deliberate breaths, willing my heart to slow down. The sun was warm on my face. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the maple tree in the yard. The world outside was exactly as it had been 10 minutes ago. Normal. Peaceful. But I was no longer the same person who had rushed into this yard. That Evelyn Parker was gone forever, vanished in the space of a single, overheard conversation. The woman who stood in her place was someone new. She was colder, harder. The soft, trusting parts of her had been burned away in the furnace of their casual cruelty. What was left was something else. Something forged. They had laid out their entire battle plan. Confident in my ignorance. They had handed me their playbook, detailing every move they planned to make. And in their arrogance, they had made their first, and final, mistake. They had underestimated me. They saw a grieving widow. A forgetful old woman. An obstacle. They had no idea they were about to go to war. I stood there, pressed against the clapboard siding of my own home, until the murmur of their voices inside faded into the ambient hum of a quiet afternoon. The immediate threat of discovery had passed, but the chill it left behind was permanent. It was in my bones. They were drafting a letter. A letter to Dr. Ramirez. The thought was a separate, more intimate violation. It was one thing to plot against me in the abstract, to talk of conservatorships and market values. It was another thing entirely to begin the methodical process of turning my own world against me, piece by piece, person by person. They weren't just planning a heist, they were salting the earth of my entire life so that nothing could ever grow there again. Dr. Ramirez. Maria Ramirez. She wasn't just a physician, she was a fixture in the timeline of my family's health and heartbreaks. She was the one who diagnosed Grace's childhood asthma, who stitched up Bob's hand after a mishap with a table saw, who sat with me in her quiet office, her own eyes filled with tears, and explained the results of Bob's final MRI. She had known me not as a patient file, but as Evelyn Parker. She had seen my strength, my resilience. And now, my daughter and her husband were going to her with a carefully constructed fiction, a narrative of my decline designed to transform a trusted ally into an instrument of my imprisonment. I could almost see the letter Derek was composing in his head. It would be a masterpiece of manipulative prose, filled with feigned concern and strategically chosen anecdotes. We're writing to you not just as Mom's doctor, but as a friend. We've noticed some troubling lapses in her memory lately. This impulsive trip to Europe has us deeply worried. We feel, for her own safety, that a cognitive assessment is warranted. It would be so reasonable, so convincing, and Maria, a compassionate doctor trained to take the concerns of a patient's family seriously, would have no reason to doubt them. She would see a worried daughter and a responsible son-in-law. She would make a note in my file. She would schedule an appointment. The first cog in their machine would have clicked neatly into place. And it wouldn't stop there. Derek's words came back to me, tell the neighbors, tell your friends at church. They were going to weaponize my community. Mrs. Gable across the street, who had been my friend for 30 years, who brought me a casserole the day after Bob's funeral and sat with me in silence on the porch swing. She would now be primed to see pathology in my everyday actions. If I forgot the day for trash pickup, it wouldn't be a simple mistake, it would be a symptom. If I told a story I'd told before, it wouldn't be a comfortable habit of old friends, it would be evidence of cognitive decline. They would orchestrate a campaign of whispers. Grace would pull our pastor aside after service, her face a mask of sorrow. I'm just so worried about Mom since Dad passed. She's not herself. She would call my book club friends, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion. Did she seem confused to you at the last meeting? They would lay a fine, invisible net of suspicion over me, and every person I trusted, every pillar of my support system, would become a knot in that net, pulling it tighter. I would be isolated, not by walls, but by the pitying glances and worried murmurs of the very people I thought I could turn to. I would be living in a panopticon of their design, where every normal slip-up of aging was an exhibit for the prosecution. It was in that moment, standing in the fading sunlight, that the past year of my life began to reassemble itself in my mind. It wasn't a sudden flash of insight, but a slow, sickening cascade of memories, each one clicking into place to form a horrifying mosaic. Their plot hadn't started today. I hadn't stumbled upon the beginning of their conspiracy. I had stumbled upon the final planning stages of a war that had been waged against me, in secret, for months. I was already a casualty, I just hadn't known it. The soft gaslighting. That's what it was, a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts designed to make me doubt my own sanity. My car keys. 3 months ago, I had spent a frantic 45 minutes searching for them, turning the house upside down. I was late for a dental appointment, my frustration mounting into a quiet panic. I checked my purse, my coat pockets, the hook by the door, a dozen times. Finally, Derek, who had dropped by just to check in, found them. They were inside the freezer, next to a bag of frozen peas. "Whoa, Evelyn," he'd said, a gentle, chiding smile on his face. "Having one of those days?" I had laughed, embarrassed, blaming it on a senior moment, feeling a hot flush of shame. But now, I saw it differently. I never go to the freezer before leaving the house. The placement wasn't random, it was absurd. It was theatrical. It was a plant. He hadn't found my keys, he had returned them to the scene of the crime. Then there was the trip to the bank 2 months ago. I needed to move some money from savings to checking to cover the final payment for the cruise. Grace insisted on coming with me. "These new bank systems are so confusing, Mom. Let me help." At the teller window, I started to explain what I needed, and Grace cut in, her hand resting on my arm. "What my mother means to say is," she began, speaking to the teller as if I weren't there, She explained the transaction with perfect clarity while I stood by, feeling like a child. The teller, a young woman with a polite smile, directed all her questions to Grace. At the time, I felt a flicker of annoyance, a sense of being managed. I brushed it off as Grace's over-attentiveness, her need to be in control. But it wasn't that. It was a rehearsal. It was her practicing the role of my financial guardian, establishing a pattern with the bank staff of my supposed incompetence. The pressure to sell the house. It had been constant, a low-level hum of suggestion for the better part of a year. It always came from Derek, framed as practical, forward-thinking advice. He'd sit at my kitchen table, scrolling through Zillow on his phone. "Evelyn, the market in this neighborhood is unbelievable right now. You're sitting on a gold mine." When I'd say I was happy here, he'd adopt a look of deep concern. "But it's so much upkeep for one person. The property taxes, the yard work. You should be enjoying your retirement, not worrying about cleaning gutters." Grace would always chime in, the dutiful echo. "He's right, Mom. It would be so much safer and easier in a condo." Safer. Easier. Those were their code words. They sounded like care, but they meant confinement. And the brochures. They had started appearing on the coffee table about 6 months ago. Glossy, trifold pamphlets for places with names like Cedar Ridge Estates and Harbor View Senior Living. They featured smiling, silver-haired residents playing shuffleboard and taking watercolor classes. Grace would leave them there after a visit, with a casual, "I just picked this up, thought you might find it interesting." I never did. I would quietly move them to the recycling bin, feeling a vague sense of dread I couldn't articulate. They weren't just brochures. They were advertisements for the appropriate living situation Derek had just described. They were showing me samples of my cage. Each memory was a fresh betrayal. Each instance of their help was now revealed as an act of aggression. They had been moving the pieces on the board for so long, and I, in my grief and my trust, had been completely oblivious. I was the frog in a pot of slowly warming water, unaware of the heat until it was nearly at a boil. The conversation I had just overheard wasn't the fire being lit. It was the lid being placed on the pot. My passport, forgotten on the hall table, had not been a mistake. It had been an act of grace. It was the universe, or Bob, or some long-dormant instinct for survival, giving me one last chance to see the truth before the water started to boil. For a long, heart-stopping moment, the sheer scale of their deception threatened to shatter me. It was a weight so immense it felt physical, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. The grief I felt for Bob was a clean wound, a known pain I had learned to carry. This was a cancer. It had been growing in the dark, metastasizing through my life, its tendrils wrapped around every memory, every relationship I held dear. The woman who had rushed home from the airport, frantic about a missed vacation, felt like a pathetic, naive fool. My world hadn't just tilted on its axis, it had been revealed as a cheap theatrical set, and I was the only one who didn't know the play was a tragedy. My first impulse was primal. I wanted to storm into my own kitchen, the brochures for the senior communities clutched in my hand, and throw them in their faces. I wanted to scream. I wanted to see the shock on their faces, to watch their carefully constructed masks of concern crumble into the ugly, greedy truth. I wanted to demand how they could do this, how Grace, the little girl whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose fevers I had soothed, could sit there and plot the erasure of her own mother. I wanted to confront Derek, to wipe that smug, calculating smirk off his face with the sheer force of my rage. I wanted a blow-up. A reckoning. A scene of biblical proportions right there on the linoleum floor Bob had installed. But as the wave of fury crested, a deeper, colder current pulled it back. It was an instinct, ancient and quiet, the same instinct that tells a cornered animal to feign death rather than attack a predator twice its size. A blow-up would be a release for me, but it would be a victory for them. It would be the final, perfect piece of evidence they needed. "You see? She's hysterical. Unstable. Prone to outbursts. We were right to be worried. My righteous anger would be twisted and presented to a judge as proof of my mental decline. I would be playing my part in their script perfectly, the mad old woman raging against the sensible children who only wanted what was best for her. No, the word was not spoken, it was a silent, iron resolve that settled deep in my gut. I would not give them that satisfaction. I would not give them that weapon. My devastation was real, a gaping wound in my soul, but I could not let them see me bleed. Not yet. My mind, which had been a chaotic storm of shock and betrayal, began to clear. The fog of emotion receded, and in its place was a sharp, crystalline focus. This was not a family drama to be solved with tearful confrontations and heartfelt appeals. This was a war, and they had already fired the first shots. I was behind enemy lines, in my own home, and my only path to survival was through strategy and stealth. They thought I was a pawn in their game. It was time to show them I was a player. My first goal was simple, and it formed with absolute clarity. I needed to get out of this house. I couldn't be here, breathing the same air as them, listening to their poisoned whispers through the walls. But I couldn't just leave. I needed a reason, an excuse that fit the narrative of the slightly dotty, forgetful woman they thought I was. The passport, the cruise. The very tools they planned to use against me would now become my cover. I took a final, steadying breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked around the side of the house. I stepped onto the front porch, letting the screen door slam shut behind me with a familiar, noisy clap. I fumbled with my purse, making a show of searching for my keys, before finding them and unlocking the front door. I pushed it open and stepped into the hall, my heart a cold, steady metronome in my chest. "Grace? Derek?" I called out, my voice pitched to sound flustered, a little breathless. "Thank God you're here." "One?" They appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, their faces a perfect study in feigned surprise. Derek was holding a glass of iced tea, the picture of casual relaxation. Grace wiped her hands on a dish towel, her brow furrowed with practiced concern. "Mom? What are you doing here?" she asked. "Did you miss your flight?" No, I said, waving a dismissive hand, forcing a self-deprecating laugh. "Worse. I got all the way to the check-in counter, can you believe it, and realized I'd left my passport sitting right here on the table." I pointed to the small mahogany console table where the dark blue booklet lay, a testament to my absent-mindedness. I must have had my head in the clouds. I feel like such an idiot. Relief washed over Grace's face, so pure and undisguised it was almost comical. It was the relief of a liar whose cover story has been unexpectedly corroborated. "Oh, Mom. Don't be silly. It happens to everyone." Derek stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. His touch felt like a spider. "That's what we're here for, Evelyn. To be your backup. Good thing you realized it before the plane took off." His smile was warm, reassuring. If I hadn't heard what I'd heard, I would have been grateful. Now, his feigned kindness was more chilling than any overt threat. "Well, I've got to run," I said, snatching the passport and tucking it into my purse, a gesture of frantic haste. "They rebooked me on a later flight, but I have to be there in an hour. No time to chat." "Are you sure you're okay to drive back?" Grace asked, her voice dripping with the concern he had just coached her to perform. "You seem a little frazzled." "I'm fine, dear. Just annoyed with myself," I said, already moving toward the door. "Now, you two have a good time. Water the roses. And don't worry about me. I'll send a postcard from Athens." I didn't wait for their replies. I walked out the door, closing it firmly behind me, and didn't allow myself to exhale until I was back in the driver's seat of my car. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was the vibrating energy of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I had done it. I had faced them, played my part, and they had bought it completely. The look in their eyes was not suspicion, but a shared, smug satisfaction. Their plan was working even better than they'd hoped. Their mother was so far gone she couldn't even manage to get to the airport with her own passport. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I could see the front of my house, the house Bob and I had built, standing serene and lovely in the afternoon light. It was no longer just a home. It was a battlefield. And I had just successfully completed my first covert operation. The trip was no longer a vacation. It was a tactic. It would give me 2 weeks. 2 weeks away from their prying eyes and their constant, low-level psychological warfare. 2 weeks to think, to plan, to transform myself from a victim into a strategist. While they believed I was sipping cocktails on a deck chair, gallivanting my way through the Greek Isles, I would be assembling my defenses. My first goal was to gather proof. Hard, undeniable proof. Derek had spoken of a game of chess. He was right. And in chess, you don't make a move until you understand the entire board. I needed to know everything. I needed to document their lies, their manipulations, their conspiracy. They were building a case against me based on fiction. I would build a case against them based on cold, hard facts. Before they could make a single legal move, before they could file a single piece of paper with a court, I would have an arsenal of my own. They had started this war, but I was going to finish it. The road back to the airport felt different this time. The red lights were no longer obstacles, they were opportunities to breathe, to think. The cruise ship was no longer a vessel for pleasure, it was my war room, my floating fortress. And I, Evelyn Parker, was no longer a grieving widow. I was a general, planning her counterattack. The second time I walked through the sliding glass doors of SeaTac Airport that day, I was a different woman. The frantic energy of the morning had been replaced by a cold, humming purpose. The cheerful cacophony of travelers, the rolling announcements, the scent of Cinnabon and jet fuel, it was all the same, but I moved through it with a new and terrible clarity. My purse felt heavier now, not just because it contained the passport, but because it carried the weight of what I knew. I was an operative moving through enemy territory, and my cover was perfect. A slightly flustered, 66-year-old widow, on her first big solo adventure. I checked my bag, received my new boarding pass, and navigated the security line with the practiced ease of a frequent flyer. But my mind was miles away, back in my quiet Tacoma home, replaying every word I had overheard. Tell the neighbors. Tell your friends at church. They were already moving, rotting my support system from the inside out. I couldn't wait 2 weeks to find out how far the poison had already spread. I needed to make a call, but not from my cell phone. Paranoia, a sensation I had never known before, was now my constant companion. Derek was in tech. For all I knew, he could track my calls, read my texts. The thought was both absurd and terrifyingly plausible. After clearing security, I scanned the concourse. Amidst the sleek, modern charging stations and gourmet coffee bars, I found what I was looking for, a relic from another era, a small bank of pay phones near a restroom. It was dusty and ignored, a dinosaur in a digital age. It was perfect. I rummaged in my purse for quarters, the small metallic clink a sound from my youth. My fingers were stiff as I dialed the number, my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. It was a number I knew by heart. Isabel's. Isabel and I had been friends since our first year of teaching, 45 years ago. She was my rock, my confidant, the keeper of my stories. If Grace was planting seeds of doubt, Isabel's garden would be one of the first she'd try to sow. She picked up on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. Hello? Izzy, it's me, I said, my voice low. Evelyn. Aren't you supposed to be on a plane to Miami? Don't tell me you chickened out. Her laugh was a welcome sound, a brief, painful reminder of a simpler world. No, I'm at the airport. Had a little passport mishap, but I'm on a later flight. Listen, I can't talk for long, but I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. The humor vanished from her voice, replaced by the immediate seriousness of a true friend. Of course, Ev. What's wrong? You sound strange. I took a breath. Has Grace spoken to you in the last week or two? There was a pause. It wasn't long, maybe only 2 seconds, but in the tense silence of my paranoia, it stretched for an eternity. It was the kind of pause that precedes bad news. Yes, she did, Isabel said finally, her voice careful. She called on Tuesday. Just to check in, she said. She told me about your cruise. And what did she say about it? I pressed, my knuckles white as I gripped the cold plastic receiver. Another hesitation. Ev, she's just worried about you. You know how she is. She said. She said she was a little concerned you were taking on too much, so soon after Bob. That you'd been a bit forgetful lately. She just wanted me to make sure I called to check on you more often. The words were gentle, relayed through the filter of Isabel's kindness, but they were the exact bullets from Derek's gun. The script was already in play. My friend, my Izzy, was being enlisted as a spy, her concern repurposed as a tool of their surveillance. Tears pricked at the back of my eyes, hot and sharp, but I blinked them away with a fury. I would not cry. Not here. Not now. Crying was a luxury I could no longer afford. Izzy, I said, my voice as steady as I could make it, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Things are not what they seem. I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to do something for me. I need you to be my ears. If Grace or Derek call you, or if you hear anything from anyone else, I need you to listen. Don't challenge them. Just listen. Sound concerned. Play along. But remember every word. Can you do that for me? Evelyn, you're scaring me. What is going on? I promise I will tell you everything when I get back. But for now, I just need you to trust me. Please. Don't trust them. Trust me. The silence on the other end of the line was filled with 45 years of friendship. Isabel knew my voice. She knew my heart. She knew I was not a hysterical woman. Okay, Ev, she said, her voice firm now, all hesitation gone. I trust you. I'll be your ears. You be careful. I will, I said, and the relief was so profound it almost buckled my knees. I have to go. I hung up the phone and leaned my forehead against the cool, grimy metal of the enclosure. The first knot in their net had been loosened. I had an ally. It was a small victory, but it was a start. My next move came to me as I walked toward my gate. I was going to need more than just Isabel's ears. I needed my own. I needed a record. I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding or a faulty memory. In a brightly lit airport electronics kiosk, surrounded by headphones and travel adapters, I found it. It was tiny, no bigger than my thumb, a digital voice recorder designed for students to record lectures. It was discreet, simple, and had a 50-hour memory capacity. I bought it with cash, the crisp $20 bills a small act of defiance against the digital trails I was now convinced Derek could follow. The flight to Miami was a 5-hour stretch of suspended time. The drone of the engines was a shield, creating a pocket of anonymity at 35,000 feet. The other passengers slept, watched movies, read books. They were on vacation. I was in my command center. I declined the drink service, asked for a coffee, and pulled out a notebook and pen from my carry-on. Under the dim glow of the overhead reading light, I began to draft my plan. It was a strange, bifurcated document. On the one hand, I outlined the steps I would need to take. Step 1, secure an attorney. Not Henderson. Someone new. Someone who specializes in elder law and financial abuse. Step 2, document everything, every conversation, every interaction. Step 3, investigate. Follow the money. Where is their urgency really coming from? It was a cold, logical battle plan. But on the other side of the page, I found myself making a different kind of list. It was a list of all the small gaslighting incidents, the moments of manufactured confusion. The keys in the freezer, The cancelled magazine subscriptions I was told I'd forgotten to renew. The time Derek swore we'd had a lunch date I had no memory of making. Each one, on its own, was a tiny, dismissible thing. But together, written out in my own hand, they formed a damning, undeniable pattern of psychological warfare. I wasn't going crazy. I was being driven there. When I finally landed in Miami and took the shuttle to the port, the sheer scale of the cruise ship was overwhelming. It was a floating city of lights and music, a monument to leisure and escape. As I walked up the gangplank, swept along in a river of festive passengers, the irony was a physical ache in my chest. They were all here to forget their troubles. I was here to face mine head-on. The first few nights of the cruise were the hardest. My stateroom, with its small private balcony overlooking the endless, black ocean, felt like the loneliest place on earth. The forced gaiety of the dining room, the cheerful calls of the cruise director, the couples holding hands on the deck, it all felt like a movie I was watching from a great distance. During the day, I went through the motions. I took the shore excursions to picturesque villages, I sat by the pool with a book I never read, I smiled at the people who spoke to me. I played the part of a woman on vacation, but at night, alone in my cabin, the facade would crumble. The tears I refused to shed at the airport came in silent, racking sobs. It was a grief sharper and more bewildering than the one I felt for Bob. It was the death of the daughter I thought I knew. It was the mourning for a family that had been a lie. I would stand on my balcony, the warm, salty air on my face, and look out at the vast, indifferent darkness of the sea and sky, and I would feel an emptiness that threatened to swallow me whole. But each night, after the tears had subsided, the cold resolve would return. I would take out my little notebook and the tiny digital recorder. I would rehearse the conversations I needed to have, the questions I needed to ask. I would steel myself for the performance I would have to give when I returned home. The performance of the grateful, slightly confused, but ultimately harmless mother. They thought this cruise was my final, foolish act of independence. They had no idea. This cruise was my boot camp. It was where I was shedding the soft skin of the woman I had been and forging the armor of the woman I needed to become. The sea was not my escape. It was my whetstone, and I was sharpening myself against it. The flight back from Miami to Seattle was the inverse of the one that had taken me there. The frantic energy, the grief, the chaotic scramble of a mind reeling from betrayal, all of that had been burned away by 2 weeks of cold resolve under a Mediterranean sun. I wasn't the same woman who had left. The Evelyn Parker who walked off that plane was not a victim returning to the scene of a crime. She was a soldier returning to an occupied territory, armed with a strategy and a secret. The tan I had acquired was a piece of my camouflage. The small souvenirs in my luggage were my props. To the outside world, I was refreshed, renewed. Inside, I was a tightly coiled spring. Grace and Derek were waiting for me at baggage claim. Their smiles were bright, their hugs enthusiastic. It was a perfect performance of a loving family reunion. "Mom, you look wonderful," Grace exclaimed, taking my arm. "The sun did you good." "We were so excited to see you," Derek added, effortlessly lifting my heavy suitcase from the carousel. "We missed you." The house felt so empty. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, it slid right past the ear and into the realm of the absurd. The house wasn't empty, it was filled with their plotting, their greed. I forced a smile that felt brittle enough to crack my face. Oh, it was just what I needed. But it's good to be home. I'm exhausted. I made sure to lean on that last word, to play into the role of the weary traveler. It was the first of many performances. The drive back to Tacoma was a masterclass in their subtle manipulation. They peppered me with questions about the trip, but their listening was shallow. Their real focus was on weaving their narrative into the conversation. "Did you have any trouble with the different languages?" Grace asked, her voice laced with a delicate, pre-packaged concern. "Not at all," I said brightly. Most everyone spoke English. And I'd practiced a few Greek phrases, which they seemed to appreciate. "That's amazing, Mom." Derek chimed in from the driver's seat. "I'd get all that confused. It's a lot to keep track of." He wasn't complimenting me, he was expressing surprise at my competence, a subtle way of reinforcing the idea that my default state was confusion. I didn't take the bait. I just smiled. It was fun. Like a puzzle. When we pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly as I had left it, the roses blooming in the evening light. But as I stepped inside, the air felt different. Stale. Violated. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond physical evidence, that they had done more than just water the plants. They had been through my life. I put on a show of weary relief, dropping my purse on the hall table. Home sweet home. I think I could sleep for a week. I made my way through the house, my eyes scanning every surface, every object, cataloging the subtle disturbances they would never imagine I'd notice. It was a silent, forensic sweep of my own life. In my office, the neat stacks of files on my desk had been shuffled. I am meticulous about my paperwork. The folder for household warranties always goes on the bottom, followed by medical records, then financials on top. The order was now reversed. It was a small thing, a detail no one else would ever register. But to me, it was a seismic event. It meant they had been through my papers. They had been looking for something. Financials. I moved into the bedroom. My jewelry box, a cedar chest Bob had made for me, sat on my dresser. I never lock it. There was no need. The most valuable pieces were in a safe deposit box at the bank. What remained were things of sentimental value. I opened the lid. At first glance, everything looked normal. But I knew. A small strand of pearls my mother had given me for my high school graduation was gone. It wasn't worth much money, maybe a few $100s. But it was irreplaceable. And next to it, the small, empty space, where a pair of modest diamond stud earrings used to be. They were my everyday earrings, the first real gift Bob had ever bought me when we were still dating. The theft was both petty and profound. They weren't just looking for assets to liquidate, they were chipping away at my history, taking small, precious pieces of my past. It was an act of dominance, a way of showing themselves and, they thought, only themselves that they were already in control. In the living room, I noticed the faintest of scuff marks on the wall beneath a framed watercolor painting, a landscape of the Oregon coast Bob and I had bought on an anniversary trip. I walked over and tilted the frame. On the back, in the corner of the paper dust cover, was a tiny, penciled notation, 18x24. They had been measuring my art, cataloging my possessions, creating an inventory for the auction of my life. The evidence was all there, silent and damning. But my face betrayed nothing. I was the returning traveler, happy to be home. I sank into Bob's armchair, feigning a huge yawn. "I'm fading fast, you too. Thank you so much for picking me up, and for watching the house. You're lifesavers." "Of course, Mom," Grace said, perching on the arm of the sofa. "That's what family is for." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from reacting. I looked at her, my daughter, her face open and smiling, and felt a chasm of ice open between us. I was a stranger in my own home, talking to a woman I no longer knew. For the next few days, I played my part to perfection. I was forgetful. I would walk into a room and stop, a puzzled look on my face. "Now, what did I come in here for?" I'd ask aloud. I'd misplace my reading glasses, and have Grace find them for me in an obvious spot. I'd let Derek explain how to use the new television remote, nodding with a vague, pleasant confusion, even though I had read the manual and knew its functions perfectly. I masked what I knew behind a carefully constructed veil of the exact symptoms they wanted to see, and they, in turn, lapped it up. Their exchanges were filled with knowing glances, with the patient sighs of long-suffering children. They were so confident in my decline, so sure of their own cleverness, that it never occurred to them that they were the ones being observed. While I was performing my role at home, the real Evelyn Parker was moving with silent, swift precision. On the third day after my return, I told Grace I was going to my book club meeting. Instead, I drove downtown. Not to Mr. Henderson's familiar, wood-paneled office, but to a sleek, modern building of glass and steel. My appointment was with a man named Jordan Ellis. I had found him from the cruise ship, using the ship's Wi-Fi for a few precious, expensive hours to research elder law attorneys in Tacoma. His website was direct, his testimonials glowing, and his specialty was clear: protecting seniors from financial abuse and fraudulent guardianship claims. He was exactly the weapon I needed. His office was on the 20th floor, with a panoramic view of Commencement Bay. He was younger than I expected, with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze. There was no patronizing softness in his eyes. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm. He looked at me not as a confused old woman, but as a client. "Mrs. Parker," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you for coming in. Your initial email was compelling. Why don't you start from the beginning?" And so I did. For over an hour, I laid it all out. The overheard conversation. The soft gaslighting. The missing jewelry. The shuffled files. I spoke calmly, factually, presenting the evidence as I had organized it in my mind. I left out the emotion, the heartbreak. This was not a therapy session. This was a briefing. He listened without interruption, his pen still, his eyes locked on mine. He didn't take notes. He absorbed everything. When I finished, there was a long silence in the room, broken only by the distant cry of a seagull. "They're aggressive," he said finally, his voice a low, steady baritone. "The move to establish a conservatorship while you're healthy is a classic, predatory move. They're not waiting for a crisis, they're trying to manufacture one." "So what do I do?" I asked. "We do two things at once," he said, leaning forward. "First, we harden your defenses. We are going to make your estate plan an ironclad fortress. We'll draft a new, durable power of attorney with such specific, limited triggers that they'll never be able to exploit it. We'll put advanced fraud alerts on all your financial accounts. We'll make it so that not $1 can move without your direct, multi-factor authenticated approval. We will build a paper wall around you so high they'll never be able to climb it." The feeling of relief was so intense, it was dizzying. A wall. A fortress. It was exactly what I needed. "Second," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly, "we start building our own case. You were right to suspect you need proof. A judge will listen to a concerned daughter, but they will also listen to a detailed record of manipulation and attempted theft. We need a paper trail of our own. We need to document every move they make, every lie they tell, from this moment forward." He stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the bay. "They think you're playing checkers, Mrs. Parker. We're going to play chess." It was the same phrase Derek had used. But coming from Jordan Ellis, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a promise. I left his office an hour later, armed with a plan and a new, powerful ally. The documents would be drafted by the end of the week. The first stone in my fortress had been laid. As I walked to my car, the Tacoma sea air, usually so damp and gray, felt clean and sharp in my lungs. They had made me a stranger in my own home, a prisoner in my own life. But the fight had begun, and they had no idea the war was even happening. Returning to the house after my meeting with Jordan Ellis felt like stepping back onto a stage. The set was the same, the other actors were the same, but I now had a different director and a new script, one only I could read. My performance of the forgetful mother became more refined, more nuanced. I was no longer just acting, I was gathering intelligence. The tiny digital recorder I'd bought at the airport became my most essential tool. It was my secret ear, my silent, infallible witness. I would leave it in a ceramic pot on the kitchen counter when I went to take a nap. I'd tuck it between the cushions of Bob's armchair before I went out to work in the garden. It was a constant, nerve-wracking risk. If they found it, the game would be over. But the potential reward was too great to ignore. Each evening, after they'd left, I would retrieve the device and sit in my office with a pair of headphones, the door locked, my heart pounding. I would listen to the soundtrack of my own betrayal. The recordings were a chilling education in the language of manipulation. They never said anything overtly criminal. It was a masterclass in coded language, innuendo, and the patient construction of a false reality. Did you see how long it took her to find her glasses today? Grace's voice, laced with a sigh. They were right on her head. I'm telling you, Derek, it's getting worse. Just keep a log of it, honey, Derek's smooth reply. Dates, times, specific examples. It's all ammunition for Dr. Ramirez. Another time, after I'd asked him to help me with an online bill payment, a task I could do in my sleep, I heard him on the phone with what sounded like a credit card company. Yes, I'm calling on behalf of my mother-in-law, Evelyn Parker. She's getting a bit overwhelmed with all this, and we're trying to simplify things for her. Can you confirm her current balance and credit limit? He was probing, testing the defenses of my financial institutions, seeing how much information he could glean with a simple, concerned phone call. He was mapping my financial landscape before launching his invasion. The recorder captured their patterns, their strategy, their utter lack of conscience. But it didn't answer the most gnawing question: why? I understood the greed, the desire for the house and the savings. But the urgency of it, the almost frantic need to push this through now, still felt disproportionate. Derek's explanation that the market was perfect seemed too thin, too rational for the level of risk and cruelty involved. There was something else driving him, a motor humming beneath the surface that I couldn't yet see. Jordan Ellis had told me to build a paper trail. I decided I also needed to follow a human one. My opportunity came the following Wednesday. Derek had a standing routine. Every Wednesday afternoon, he would leave his downtown office early. He told Grace he was meeting with a high-stakes investment group, a story she repeated to me with a certain vicarious pride. Derek works so hard, Mom. These Wednesday meetings are where the really big deals happen. I had always accepted it without a second thought. Now, it was a glaring red flag. I waited in my car, parked 2 blocks away from his office building, a place I had only been to once for a holiday lunch. I wore a simple raincoat and a scarf over my hair, feeling like a fool in a bad spy movie. But the feeling of absurdity was quickly replaced by a hunter's focus when his sleek, black Audi pulled out of the parking garage at precisely 2:15 p.m. Instead of heading south towards the freeway and our Tacoma neighborhood, he went north. He drove over the soaring arc of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, heading toward Seattle. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't the route to a business meeting. I stayed 3 cars behind, a feat of nerve-wracking concentration, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. He drove with the easy confidence of a man traveling a familiar path. He didn't go to the financial district in downtown Seattle. He bypassed it completely, taking the exit for Ballard. It was a trendy, historic neighborhood of boutiques, breweries, and quiet, tree-lined residential streets. It made no sense. What high-stakes investment group met in Ballard on a Wednesday afternoon? He parked on a side street in front of a small, charming park. I drove past, circled the block, and found a spot half a block down, with a clear line of sight. He got out of his car, not with a briefcase, but with a grocery bag filled with what looked like fresh produce. He wasn't dressed for a boardroom, he was in casual slacks and a polo shirt. He walked, not toward a commercial building, but toward a row of well-kept craftsman houses, remarkably similar to my own. He stopped at a cheerful, seafoam greenhouse with a bright yellow door and a porch swing. He didn't knock. He used a key. He let himself in. I sat in my car, the engine off, the silence deafening. For a moment, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he managed the property for a client. Maybe it was a real estate investment. But the grocery bag, the familiar way he used the key. A cold, sick certainty began to crystallize in my gut. I waited. For 45 agonizing minutes, I sat and watched that yellow door, feeling my entire conception of my family's life crumble into dust. The door finally opened. Derek stepped out, but he wasn't alone. A woman was with him, a redhead with a warm smile. She looked to be in her late 30s. He kissed her. It wasn't a perfunctory peck on the cheek, it was a lingering, intimate kiss, the kind shared between partners at the end of a long day. And then, the final, devastating blow. 2 small children, a boy and a girl no older than 6 or 7, came tumbling out the door behind them. They swarmed Derek, wrapping their arms around his legs. "Daddy, you're back." The little girl shouted, her voice a clear, happy bell in the quiet afternoon air. "Hey, you monkeys," he said, laughing, scooping the boy up into his arms. "Did you miss me, Daddy?" The word detonated in the silence of my car. It was a bomb that vaporized everything I thought I knew. Grace. My daughter. My poor, foolish, complicit daughter. Her husband, the man she adored and defended, the man for whom she was willing to betray her own mother, was living a double life. Suddenly, everything made sense. The urgency. The desperate need for cash. The risky, aggressive plot to seize my assets. It wasn't about waiting for a perfect market. It was about funding this. This second family. This secret, parallel life. My 401k, my paid-off house, the nest egg Bob and I had spent a lifetime building. It wasn't just a windfall for him and Grace. It was the capital he needed to bankroll his deception. My daughter wasn't just a co-conspirator, she was a victim of a different, more intimate, but equally devastating fraud. I watched as the woman, Rachel, as I would later learn her name was, said goodbye. I watched as Derek buckled the 2 children into the back of his Audi. This wasn't a clandestine affair, this was a family outing. He was taking his other children to the park. My first, raw instinct was to get out of the car, to march across the street and confront him right there, to shatter his 2 perfect worlds with the force of the truth. I wanted to see the look on his face when his lies all came crashing down around him, but my new, colder self held me back. Jordan Ellis's voice echoed in my mind. "We need proof." An accusation in a park was just that, an accusation. Hysterical. Unproven. I needed more. My hand, shaking slightly, reached for my phone. I held it up, my body shielded by the car door, and took a picture. The quality was poor, grainy through the window, but it was clear enough. Derek. The woman. The 2 children who called him Dad. It was the first piece of a different kind of evidence. The motive was no longer a mystery. It had a face. It had 2, in fact, 2 small, innocent faces who had no idea their father was a thief and a liar, a man trying to destroy one family to finance another. The stakes of this war had just gotten infinitely higher. This wasn't just about protecting my assets anymore. It was about exposing a rot that went deeper than I could have ever imagined. And in a strange, terrible way, it was now also about protecting my daughter from the man she thought she knew. The man who was using her, just as he was using me, as a means to an end. The drive back to Tacoma was a disorienting journey through a landscape that was both familiar and utterly alien. The familiar curves of the highway, the distant silhouette of Mount Rainier, the green blur of the Pacific Northwest fir trees, it was the backdrop to my entire adult life. But I was seeing it through new eyes, the eyes of a woman who had just discovered that the foundations of her world were built on a sinkhole of deceit. The grainy photograph on my phone was a radioactive artifact, a toxic secret I was now carrying back into the heart of my family. It changed everything. Derek wasn't just a greedy son-in-law. He was a predator of a different order, a man juggling 2 realities, fueled by a breathtaking level of narcissism. And Grace, my daughter, was no longer just a conspirator. She was a pawn in a much larger, more personally devastating game than she could ever imagine. She was both a perpetrator and a victim, a duality that twisted a knife in my heart even as I catalogued her betrayals against me. My rage towards her was now complicated by a terrible, aching pity. She was helping him build a financial empire on the ruins of my life, completely unaware that he was already building a second family in its shadow. My strategy, which had been a straightforward campaign of self-defense, now required a new, more delicate approach. A direct confrontation with both of them, armed with my new knowledge, would be a chaotic explosion. Derek would lie, twist, and deflect. Grace, caught between the two realities, would likely shatter, her loyalty torn, her mind unable to process the dual betrayals. I needed to separate them. I needed to isolate my daughter, to test the foundations of her allegiance to him, to see just how deep the rot had gone. Was she a willing soldier in his army, or a brainwashed captive? The answer would determine my next move. I waited 2 days, a period of agonizing self-control. I continued my performance of gentle decline, of pleasant confusion. I let Derek help me sort my mail. I let Grace remind me about an upcoming doctor's appointment she herself had made. I smiled, I nodded, I played the part of the fading matriarch, all while the knowledge of his other life burned behind my eyes. I watched them together, observing their dynamic with the cold, detached eye of a behavioral scientist. I saw the way Grace looked at him, with a kind of desperate admiration. I saw the way he touched her, a proprietary hand on the small of her back, a gesture that looked like affection but was, in fact, an act of control. They were a team, and my first objective was to split that team apart. On Saturday morning, I called Grace. "Honey, I was hoping you could come over for a little while this afternoon." "Just you," I said, adding a crucial, carefully chosen phrase. "There are a few financial things that Derek explained to me, but I think I'd understand them better if another woman walked me through them. You know how men can be, always rushing." I was baiting the hook with a lure of gender solidarity and a confirmation of her role as my helper. It was a calculated risk. If she insisted on bringing Derek, I'd know his control over her was absolute. There was a slight pause. I could hear the silent calculation on her end. "Oh. Okay, Mom," she said finally. "Derek was going to help me with some yard work here, but I can come over around 2. Is that okay?" "Perfect, dear," I said, my voice warm and grateful. "We'll have coffee in the dining room. Like old times." The trap was set. She arrived at 2 o'clock sharp, alone. It was a small victory, but a significant one. She brought a store-bought coffee cake, a gesture of dutiful daughterhood. I had already set out my best china, the delicate, rose-patterned cups Bob and I had received as a wedding gift. I wanted the setting to be steeped in a history she and Derek were trying to erase, a silent reminder of a time before his influence. We sat opposite each other at the polished mahogany table, the same table where she'd done her homework as a child, where we'd celebrated dozens of birthdays. The air was thick with unspoken things. She began, as I knew she would, by launching into the script. "So, what's on your mind, Mom? Derek told me you had some questions about the portfolio." "Yes," I said, taking a slow sip of coffee. "It's all so complicated. He was talking about rebalancing and asset allocation." "It goes right over my head." I watched her face. She visibly relaxed, settling into her familiar role as the patient, knowledgeable daughter guiding her confused mother. "It's not so bad once you get the hang of it," she said, her voice taking on the slightly patronizing tone she had perfected. "The main thing is to make sure your assets are working for you. We're worried that just letting them sit in those old accounts isn't the best strategy for your long-term security." My long-term security. The euphemism was so bald-faced it was almost impressive. I let her talk for a few minutes, outlining their strategy for my finances. I nodded, asked a few simple, clarifying questions, and let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I made my first move. "It's funny," I said, looking thoughtfully at the floral centerpiece on the table. "I was at the bank the other day just to deposit a check and the teller mentioned something odd. She said there had been a few online inquiries about opening a home equity line of credit against the house. Grace's composure didn't just fracture, it splintered. It was a visible, physical reaction. Her smile froze, the color drained from her cheeks, and her hand, which was lifting her coffee cup, stopped mid-air. She put the cup back down with a clatter that was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "A line of credit?" she repeated, her voice a full octave higher than before. I don't know anything about that. It must have been a mistake. A marketing call. Perhaps, I said, my voice still mild, my gaze unwavering. But she seemed quite specific. She even mentioned the paperwork had been initiated online. I suppose it's just one of those mix-ups. I let the lie hang there, a glittering, dangerous thing. I hadn't been to the bank. But they didn't know that. And the fact that they had been planning this move, a move they hadn't told me about, was now a live grenade on the table between us. Grace fumbled for words, her carefully rehearsed script completely forgotten. "Derek handles most of the online. He's probably just exploring options. You know, as part of the overall strategy. For your security." She was floundering, trying to shove the ugly truth back into the pretty box of their narrative. I didn't give her the chance. I moved on to my second attack. "And the strangest thing," I continued, as if just remembering another amusing anecdote. "I was looking for my mother's pearls the other day. The simple strand she gave me for graduation. I wanted to have the clasp repaired. I just can't seem to find them anywhere." I looked directly at her, my expression one of simple, grandmotherly puzzlement. "You haven't seen them, have you, dear? I know you've been helping me tidy up." This time, she flinched. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but I saw it. Her eyes darted away from mine, fixing on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. The pearls were not a high-value item, but they were specific. Tangible. Their absence was not a misunderstanding, it was a fact. And it was a fact that implicated her directly in the petty thefts that had been taking place in my home. "Your pearls?" she stammered. No, Mom, I haven't seen them. You've probably just misplaced them. You know how you do sometimes. 1 to the wicks. 1 to the 2. It was a weak, reflexive jab, an attempt to fall back on the established narrative of my forgetfulness. But the words had no conviction. The foundation was cracking. She was being confronted with evidence, not accusations. Evidence that suggested I was not as oblivious as she had been led to believe. The helper was suddenly being questioned by the person she was supposed to be helping. The power dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted. I let the silence sit for a full minute, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall measuring out the beats of her rising panic. She was trapped between the lies she had been telling and the truth she could see dawning in my eyes. She had come here to manage me, to push their agenda forward. Instead, she was being dismantled, piece by piece, by a series of quiet, unanswerable questions. Finally, I offered her a way out, a final test. I softened my expression, letting a look of weary sadness come over my face. "You're probably right," I sighed. "I lose everything these days. My mind just isn't what it used to be. It's a good thing I have you and Derek to look out for me. I don't know what I'd do without you." I watched her. I watched her closely to see what she would do with the lifeline I had just thrown her. Would she grab it? Would she double down on the lie, relieved to be back on the familiar ground of my incompetence? Or would she see the truth? Would she see the pain and knowledge in my eyes and finally, break? For a moment, I saw a flicker of something in her expression. A shadow of the little girl she used to be, a flash of guilt, a hint of sorrow, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a mask of brittle resolve. She was in too deep. Her loyalty, her future, her very identity were now inextricably tied to Derek and his plan. To admit the truth now would be to admit her own monstrous foolishness. She reached across the table and patted my hand, her touch cold and clammy. "Don't you worry about a thing, Mom," she said, her smile firmly back in place, though it didn't reach her eyes. "That's why we're here. We'll take care of everything. And in that moment, I had my answer. She wasn't a captive. She was a volunteer, a willing participant who, when confronted with the cracks in her reality, chose to paper them over with more lies rather than face the ugly truth. The pity I had felt for her curdled into something harder. She had made her choice. Now, I could make mine. The time for delicate tests was over. It was time for a showdown. Grace left soon after that, a flurry of strained cheerfulness and promises to help me look for those pearls later. The moment the front door clicked shut behind her, the warmth and nostalgia I had so carefully curated in the dining room evaporated, leaving behind the cold, hard vacuum of reality. She had failed the test. She had looked the truth in the eye and chosen the lie. There was no reaching her, no appealing to the daughter she used to be. She was his. And my next move could no longer be about trying to save her, it had to be about saving myself. The conversation, as unsettling as it was, had served its purpose. I had planted seeds of doubt. I had cracked the foundation of their united front. Grace would go home to Derek, not with a report of a successful meeting, but with a series of unnerving questions. She would be rattled, her confidence shaken, and a rattled opponent is a predictable opponent. I knew they would accelerate their plans. My quiet, unexpected questions would be interpreted not as a sign of dawning awareness, but as a symptom of paranoia, another piece of evidence for their case. They would feel a new urgency to finalize their control before I became too difficult. I was counting on it. I spent the rest of the weekend in a state of hyper-alert calm, a soldier in a foxhole waiting for the inevitable bombardment to begin. I made a few calls. The first was to Jordan Ellis, briefing him on the conversation with Grace. The second was to Isabel, asking her to be ready. The third was to a local locksmith. By Saturday evening, every external lock on my house had been changed. The old locks, the ones Grace had a key to, sat on my kitchen counter, inert and useless lumps of brass. The showdown came on Monday. It didn't begin with a phone call or a polite knock. It began with the sound of a key scraping against a lock it no longer fit. I was in the living room, ostensibly reading a book, but my senses were tuned to the frequency of confrontation. I heard the footsteps on the porch, the confident stride of a man who believed he owned the ground he walked on. Then came the metallic scratch, a sound of grating frustration. A pause. Another, more forceful attempt. Then, a sharp, angry jiggle of the doorknob. He had a key. A key I had never given him. The realization was a splash of icy water. He hadn't just been a visitor in my home, he had established his own access, a secret, unauthorized entry that spoke volumes about his sense of entitlement. He must have copied Grace's key months ago. This house wasn't a place he visited, it was a property he was in the process of acquiring. The doorbell rang, a sharp, impatient buzz. I took a slow, deliberate breath, placed my bookmark in my novel, and walked to the door. I opened it to find Derek standing on my porch, his face a thundercloud of annoyance. Grace stood a few steps behind him, looking anxious. "Evelyn," he started, his voice tight with a poorly concealed anger. "The key isn't working." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "I know," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "I had the locks changed. A security upgrade. You can't be too careful these days." I let my eyes meet his, holding his gaze without blinking. For the first time, I let him see a flicker of the steel that lay beneath the soft, forgetful exterior I had so carefully constructed. His mask of the concerned son-in-law slipped. Just for a second, but I saw it. I saw the flash of raw fury in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. He was a predator who had just found the door to the henhouse unexpectedly barred. "A security upgrade?" He scoffed, recovering quickly. "Why didn't you tell us? We were worried." "Oh, it was a spur-of-the-moment thing," I said breezily. "One of the neighbors had a break-in." It got me thinking. "Won't you come in?" I stepped back, opening the door wider. They walked into the hall, into the heart of my territory, and the trap was sprung. They expected a conversation, another round of manipulation where they held all the cards. They were not prepared for what was waiting for them. I led them into the living room. On the coffee table, where the glossy brochures for senior living communities had once sat, was a single, neat manila folder. Nothing else. Its presence was stark, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. "What's this?" Grace asked, her voice trembling slightly. The locked door, my calm demeanor, the folder. It was a combination of things that did not fit the narrative she had been fed. "Please, sit down," I said. It was not a request. It was a command. They sat, perched awkwardly on the edge of the sofa, their eyes fixed on the folder. I did not sit. I stood before them, in front of the fireplace that Bob and I had built, its stones cool and solid at my back. I was no longer playing a part. The performance was over. "We need to talk about your plans for my future," I began, my voice even and clear. "Your plans for my long-term security." Derek opened his mouth to speak, to launch into one of his smooth, reasonable explanations, but I cut him off. "No, Derek. It's my turn to talk. I've been doing a lot of listening lately." I paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. "I've also been doing some thinking about your own financial situation. It must be very expensive, funding two separate households, one here in Tacoma, and the other one in Ballard." The name of the neighborhood dropped into the quiet room like a stone into a deep, still pond. The color vanished from Derek's face. It didn't just drain, it was instantly gone, leaving behind a waxy, gray pallor. His eyes, which had been so full of arrogant confidence, were suddenly wide with a primal, cornered animal fear. Grace just looked confused. "Ballard? What are you talking about, Mom?" I ignored her, my eyes still locked on her husband. "I believe her name is Rachel," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "A lovely woman. And the children are adorable. They look so much like you, Derek. Especially the little boy." He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, all his glib words, his smooth corporate jargon, utterly gone. He was stripped bare, his secret life exposed in the placid, sunlit living room of the woman he had intended to destroy. It was at that precise, perfect moment that the doorbell rang again. Derek flinched as if he'd been shot. Grace just looked from me to her husband, her face a mask of bewildered panic. "I'll get that," I said calmly. I walked to the door and opened it. Standing on my porch were two people. The first was my attorney, Jordan Ellis, dressed in a sharply tailored suit, his expression grim and professional. The second was a woman I had never met, but whose presence radiated a tough, no-nonsense competence. "Evelyn," Jordan said with a slight nod. "This is Dana Ruiz. She's a licensed private investigator." I stepped aside and they entered the hall. I led them back to the living room, where Derek was still sitting, frozen, and Grace was now on her feet, looking wildly between me and the newcomers. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Who are these people?" "They're my new financial advisory team," I said. "Miss Ruiz has been conducting a thorough audit of my assets. And of Derek's." Dana Ruiz didn't smile. She opened the briefcase she was carrying and took out a folder of her own, thicker than mine. She laid it on the coffee table next to my simple manila file. "Mr. Gardner," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We've been looking into your Wednesday afternoon investment meetings." She opened her folder. The first thing on top was a photograph. A clear, high-resolution 8x10. It showed Derek, Rachel, and the two children, laughing on the porch swing of the seafoam greenhouse in Ballard. Grace gasped, a sharp, wounded sound, as if all the air had been punched from her lungs. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes locked on the impossible, undeniable image. Dana Ruiz was just getting started. She laid out more photographs. She produced bank statements, highlighting transfers from joint accounts. Grace shared with Derek into other accounts under a different name. She had property records for the house in Ballard, co-signed by Derek and a Rachel Patterson. She had a copy of an employment application Derek had filled out for a side consulting job, on which he had declared himself single with 2 dependents. It was a meticulous, irrefutable deconstruction of his entire life. The con wasn't just collapsing, it was being dissected with surgical precision, each lie pinned to the board like a specimen in a lab. Jordan Ellis stepped forward. The evidence Miss Ruiz has gathered suggests a number of potential criminal activities, Derek, he said, his voice cold as a courtroom floor, including bank fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. And that's before we even get to the matter of the fraudulent guardianship petition you were preparing to file against your own mother-in-law, based on fabricated evidence of cognitive decline. Derek finally found his voice. It was a hoarse, strangled thing. This is insane. You can't prove any of this. It's a misunderstanding. Is it? I asked, my voice still quiet. I reached into my own folder and took out a single piece of paper. It was a sworn affidavit from the locksmith who had changed my locks, attesting to the fact that the key Derek had tried to use was a recent, unauthorized copy of my daughter's house key. Proof of his unauthorized access. Proof of his intent. The showdown was over. He was checkmated. Surrounded. And the final piece, the one that would tip the entire board over, was about to walk through the door. The silence that followed Jordan's methodical takedown was a living thing. It was thick with the wreckage of 2 lives, punctuated only by Grace's ragged, disbelieving breaths. She was staring at the 8x10 photograph on the coffee table, the image of her smiling, treacherous husband with his other family, as if trying to will it into non-existence through the sheer force of her shock. The woman in that picture, Rachel, was not just a secret. She was the living, breathing answer to the question Grace had never known to ask. The motive, the urgency, the bottomless well of deception, it all had a face. Derek, for his part, was a statue carved from ash. The glib confidence, the predatory charm, the sheer, unadulterated arrogance that had defined him was gone, vaporized by the harsh light of exposure. He was just a man in a living room, surrounded by the irrefutable evidence of his own treachery. He looked from the damning photos to Jordan's implacable face, to Dana's cold, professional stare, and finally to me. In his eyes, I saw not remorse, but the pure, animal panic of a creature whose burrow has been flooded, leaving no path for escape. It was into this tableau of silent devastation that the doorbell chimed again, a polite, melodic sound that was utterly incongruous with the emotional carnage in the room. No one moved. The sound hung in the air, a question mark. "I believe that will be for you, Mr. Gardner," Dana Ruiz said, her voice as impassive as ever. She hadn't been surprised by the bell. This, too, was part of the plan. I was the one who walked to the door and opened it. Standing on my porch was the woman from the photograph. Rachel Patterson. She was taller than I had realized, with intelligent, questioning eyes the color of moss. She held a large manila envelope in her hands and her expression was a mixture of anxiety and grim determination. She was not the other woman, the homewrecker. She was another victim, another woman who had been meticulously deceived, and she had been convinced by Dana Ruiz to come here today to reclaim her own truth. "Mrs. Parker?" she asked, her voice steady. "Please, come in, Rachel," I said gently. I led her into the living room. The moment she stepped through the doorway, the scene froze, a perfect, horrifying tableau. Derek's head snapped up, a strangled sound escaping his throat. Grace looked from the photograph in her hand to the living woman who had just walked into her life, and a low, wounded moan escaped her lips. It was the sound of a heart breaking in real time. Rachel's eyes, however, were fixed on only one person. "Derek?" she said, and the single word was freighted with a universe of pain and confusion. "Dana told me. She said you weren't a widower. She said your wife was alive." His wife. The word landed like a physical blow on Grace. "She showed me this," Rachel continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a rising, righteous anger. She opened the envelope she was carrying and pulled out a document. This is a loan application for a business I thought we were starting together. You told me your first wife, Grace, died of cancer 2 years ago. You told me her mother, Evelyn, was a wealthy eccentric whose estate you were managing as the sole executor. You said the money from her house would be the seed capital for our future. She held out the document. On the signature line, clear as day, was Derek's name. Beside it, he had checked a box, marital status, widowed. The final lie was exposed, the one that connected his two fraudulent worlds. He hadn't just been cheating on Grace, he had erased her. He had declared her dead to finance his life with another woman, a woman he had also been systematically deceiving. He was not just a bigamist of the heart, he was a con artist who used lives as collateral. You told her I was dead? Grace whispered, the words barely audible. The betrayal was so complete, so monstrous, it was beyond the scope of normal human comprehension. He hadn't just been unfaithful. He had performed a narrative execution, killing her off in his other life so that he could be free. Derek said nothing. There was nothing left to say. His empire of lies, built so carefully over years, had been demolished in the space of 10 minutes. It was Jordan Ellis who spoke into the wreckage. The lies you told Miss Patterson constitute a clear pattern of fraud, Mr. Gardner, he said, his voice cutting through the emotional haze. But the plan you set in motion against your mother-in-law, Mrs. Parker, crosses into a different realm of criminality. The gang. He picked up a document from Dana's file. This, he said, holding it up, is a draft of a petition for an emergency conservatorship, retrieved from the hard drive of your home computer, for which Miss Ruiz obtained a warrant. In it, you and your wife, Grace Gardner, allege that Evelyn Parker is a danger to herself, citing fabricated evidence of cognitive decline, with the express intent of seizing control of her assets. He looked directly at me. Had you not forgotten your passport that day, had you not returned home and overheard their conversation, this process would already be in motion. They would have used your absence during the cruise as proof of your irresponsibility. He then turned his gaze back to Derek. Conspiracy to commit theft is one thing, but when that theft involves manipulating the legal system to unlawfully deprive a senior citizen of their civil liberties and their property, it has a different name. It's called conspiracy to commit unlawful confinement. It's a serious felony, Mr. Gardner. One that judges and prosecutors take very, very seriously. Unlawful confinement. The legal term was so much colder, so much more brutal than putting her in a home. It was the truth, stripped of all its euphemistic padding. They had been plotting to imprison me. As if on cue, a shadow fell across the living room window. A quiet, dark blue sedan had pulled up to the curb. It was unmarked, but its purpose was unmistakable. A moment later, 2 uniformed Tacoma Police Department officers were walking up my porch steps. Isabel had made the call, just as we had planned, the moment she received a coded text message from my phone. One of the officers, a tall, somber man with a calm demeanor, stepped into the open doorway. We received a call about a possible situation of elder fraud and a domestic disturbance, he said. His eyes taking in the scene, the shattered, Grace, the ashen-faced Derek, the composed lawyers, the second, unknown woman. There's no disturbance, officer, Jordan said smoothly. But I believe you'll want to speak with this man, Derek Gardner. The officers stepped inside. They listened patiently as Jordan and Dana laid out a concise, top-level summary of the evidence: the financial fraud, the dual identity, the conspiracy against me. They looked at the photograph of Derek's second family. They looked at the fraudulent loan application. Derek, who had been catatonic, was finally spurred into a desperate, last-ditch act of self-preservation. "This is a family matter," he blurted out, his voice cracking. "A misunderstanding. My mother-in-law is... she's confused. She's been having memory problems." It was his last, pathetic attempt to play the card he thought was his ace. But the room was no longer his stage. The audience was no longer his to manipulate. I stepped forward, my voice calm and clear. "Officer," I said. "This man, my son-in-law, has been systematically stealing from me. He and my daughter were conspiring to have me declared legally incompetent so they could sell my home and take control of my life savings. He has a second family in Seattle that he has been funding with money defrauded from his own wife and from me. Everything my attorney has told you is the truth." The lead officer looked from Derek's panicked face to my steady gaze. He had seen this story before, in 100 different forms. The predator and the prey. He nodded slowly. "Mr. Gardner," he said, his voice now devoid of any ambiguity, "I need you to stand up and place your hands behind your back." The collapse was total. The fight drained out of Derek, replaced by a limp, slack-jawed disbelief. He had been so clever, so certain of his own superiority, that the possibility of actual consequences, of handcuffs and a police car, had never truly entered his mind. It was all just a game of chess, and he had never imagined his king could actually be taken. The click of the handcuffs was a sharp, definitive sound in the quiet living room. As they read him his rights, the familiar words of the Miranda warning sounded like a pronouncement from another world, a world of rules and consequences that had finally, violently, crashed into his. He didn't look at Grace. He didn't look at Rachel. As they led him out the door, his eyes met mine one last time. They were filled not with hatred or remorse, but with a kind of baffled fury. It was the look of a master manipulator who simply could not comprehend how the puppet had managed to cut its own strings. The moment the front door closed behind the police officers, taking Derek and the shattered remnants of his 2 lives with them, the silence he left behind was heavier than the one that had preceded his arrest. It was a vacuum, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 lies. The raw, adrenalized energy of the confrontation, the cold, hard lines of the strategy I had so meticulously executed, all of it dissipated, leaving a profound and unsettling quiet. There was no triumphant surge of victory, no cathartic release. I had won. I had protected myself, my home, my future. But the cost was written on the faces of the 2 women who remained in my living room. I felt vindicated, yes, but I also felt profoundly, deeply heartsick. Grace was a heap on the floor, huddled by the sofa, her body racked with dry, silent sobs. She wasn't just crying, she was disintegrating. Her entire reality, her marriage, her husband, her future, her very identity as a beloved wife had been publicly detonated. She had been a willing accomplice in a crime against me, but she was also the primary victim of a much more intimate, soul-crushing deception. The man she had betrayed her own mother for had declared her dead. There was no coming back from a betrayal of that magnitude. It was an annihilation of the self. Rachel, on the other hand, stood by the window, her back to the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was staring out at the quiet street where the police car had just disappeared. Her grief was a different shape, quieter, harder. She was the woman who had been sold a future based on a foundation of lies and stolen money. Her love story was a fraud, her partner a fiction. The father of her children was not the honorable widower she had believed him to be, but a common thief and a cheat. She had not just lost a partner, she had lost her own past, which now had to be re-examined through the lens of this new, ugly truth. Jordan Ellis and Dana Ruiz began to pack their briefcases with a quiet, professional efficiency. Their work here was done. The legal and investigative machinery had been set in motion. "The district attorney's office will be in touch, Evelyn," Jordan said, his voice softer now. "They'll likely file for an emergency freeze on all of Derek's known assets, including any joint accounts he shared with Grace. We will work with them to ensure your own assets are clearly and legally firewalled from that process." I nodded, the words barely registering. Assets. Accounts. Firewalls. It was the language of the war I had just fought, but it felt hollow now, disconnected from the human wreckage in the room. "We've also compiled a complete file for Adult Protective Services," Dana added, her voice retaining its professional edge, but with a flicker of something that might have been sympathy in her eyes. Your case is a textbook example of attempted elder financial abuse. Having it on record will provide another layer of protection for you going forward. It creates an official, state-level narrative of what was attempted here, which will supersede any fictions they might try to create later. She paused, then added a final, crucial detail. The file includes a timeline of Grace's communications with Dr. Ramirez, cross-referenced with Derek's financial activities, and it includes the HIPAA-compliant request we filed to review your mother's records, which Dr. Ramirez, to her credit, had already flagged as unusual family pressure. His influence was documented even before we got involved. Dr. Ramirez. My doctor had seen the red flags. She had trusted her professional instincts over the manipulations of my family. It was a small, bright point of light in the overwhelming darkness. Not everyone had been fooled. Not everyone had been corrupted. They saw themselves out, leaving the three of us, the matriarch, the daughter, and the other woman, alone in the quiet house. I should have felt anger. I should have felt a cold, righteous satisfaction. But looking at Grace, a crumpled mess of a woman who had lost everything because she had been so willing to help take everything from me, I just felt a profound, bottomless sorrow. I walked to the kitchen and filled a glass with water. My hand was perfectly steady. I brought it to Grace and knelt beside her, placing it on the floor in front of her. She flinched at my closeness, curling further into herself. "Drink this, Grace," I said. My voice was not accusatory. It was not forgiving. It was simply neutral. The voice of a woman stating a fact. She shook her head, her face buried in her hands. I didn't press her. I stood up and walked over to Rachel, who still hadn't moved from the window. "I am so sorry," I said, and the words were utterly inadequate, but they were the only ones I had. "I am so sorry for the part my family has played in the lies you were told." She finally turned to look at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed but tearless. "It's not your fault," she said, her voice raspy. "He fooled me completely. He fooled everyone." She looked over at the sobbing form of my daughter. "He fooled her most of all." There was no malice in her voice, only a shared, desolate understanding of the man who had connected their lives in this terrible way. The days that followed were a blur of legal activity, a stark contrast to the emotional inertia that had settled over my house. Jordan Ellis was true to his word. He moved with the speed and precision of a master craftsman, building the fortress he had promised. The old, vulnerable Evelyn Parker financial ecosystem was dismantled and replaced with something new and impregnable. My banking was the first priority. All existing accounts were locked down. New accounts were opened at a different institution, under new numbers. Jordan implemented multi-factor authentication controls that were almost comically complex. To transfer more than $1,000, I would need to enter a password, receive a code on my phone, and then answer a security question that only I could possibly know: the name of my first pet, a cantankerous hamster named Augustus. The age of Grace, helping me at the bank, was over, permanently. Next came the estate plan. My old will, which had named Grace as the primary heir and Derek as the contingent, was shredded. A new, ironclad trust was created. It was filled with specific clauses and restrictions, a document born of betrayal. It had what Jordan called a no-contest clause on steroids, stipulating that any legal challenge to its terms by any family member would result in their immediate and permanent disinheritance. The durable power of attorney was the most critical piece. The new document was a work of art, a legal masterpiece of caution. It could only be triggered by the signed, notarized agreement of three separate parties: my primary care physician, a new one I would be choosing, my attorney, and my oldest friend, Isabel. All three would have to independently declare me incompetent for the document to have any power at all. The loophole Derek and Grace had tried to ram a truck through had been sealed with concrete and reinforced with steel. While I was building my walls, the state was moving on Derek. The DA, armed with the mountain of evidence Dana Ruiz had compiled, had frozen all his accounts. Grace was a financial refugee, locked out of the very joint accounts she had used to help enable his deceptions. She had no money, no husband, and no home, as she couldn't bear to return to the house she had shared with him. She was staying with a friend, a fact I learned not from her, but from a guilt-ridden, apologetic phone call from Isabel. The collapse of their plan was as swift and total as its exposure had been. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of my trust, and with one deep breath, the entire structure had been blown away. I was safe. My home was safe. My future was secure. I should have been at peace. But every night, I would sit in Bob's armchair, the house silent around me, and I would think of my daughter. I had protected myself from her, but a part of me, the stubborn, irrational mother's heart, still ached with the question of who would protect her from herself. The legal system, which had seemed like such a terrifying and alien landscape when Derek first uttered the word conservatorship, turned out to be a slow, grinding, but ultimately logical machine. The 6 months that followed the showdown in my living room were not filled with dramatic courtroom confrontations, but with the quiet, methodical work of depositions, plea bargains, and the untangling of a deeply interwoven financial fraud. The DA's case, built on the bedrock of Dana Ruiz's investigation, was overwhelming. Derek, facing a mountain of evidence and a prosecutor who clearly had no appetite for games, saw the writing on the wall. He pleaded out. I was in the courtroom the day of his sentencing. I went alone. I needed to see this final chapter close with my own eyes. He stood before the judge, a man diminished, stripped of his tailored suits and his aura of arrogant invincibility. He was just a man in an ill-fitting, county-issued jumpsuit, his face sallow, his eyes empty. He mumbled his way through a pre-written apology to the court, a string of hollow words about mistakes and poor judgment. He never once looked at me. The judge was an older woman with a sharp, intelligent face and a reputation for being tough but fair. She listened to his apology without expression. Then she looked down at the pre-sentencing report, a document that detailed not just his crimes against me, but the systematic deception of Rachel Patterson and the callous, narrative murder of his own wife. Mr. Gardner, she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the quiet courtroom. This was not a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill on time. A mistake is making a bad investment. What you engaged in was a calculated, long-term campaign of predatory deception against the two women who trusted you most in the world. You targeted your mother-in-law, a recent widow, and attempted to strip her of her home, her life savings, and her civil liberties for your own personal gain. At the same time, you constructed an elaborate fantasy to defraud another woman, the mother of your children, building a life with her financed by your lies. This wasn't poor judgment. This was a profound and sustained crisis of character. She paused, her eyes finding his. The court finds your apology to be self-serving and entirely unconvincing. The sentence came down like a hammer. 12 years in a state penitentiary for multiple counts of felony fraud and forgery. 12 years. It wasn't a number. It was a lifetime. It was the two small children in Ballard growing up without a father. It was Grace entering her 50s with the stigma of a felon ex-husband. It was a heavy, somber, and deeply necessary consequence. As they led him away, I felt no joy, no sense of victory. I only felt the quiet, grim satisfaction of a chapter finally, irrevocably, closed. My own life, in those 6 months, had begun the slow process of recalibrating. The fortress Jordan Ellis had built around my finances gave me a profound sense of security, a peace of mind I hadn't realized I'd lost until it was restored. But the real healing was happening outside the realm of banks and legal documents. It was happening in the small, quiet corners of my daily life. The relationship with my neighbors, which I had feared was irreparably poisoned, was one of the first things to mend. The story of what had happened, in its broad strokes, had inevitably trickled through the community. But it wasn't the narrative of my cognitive decline that took root. It was the story of my resilience. Mrs. Gable from across the street came over one afternoon with a lemon meringue pie, her eyes filled with a new kind of respect. Evelyn, she said, setting the pie on my counter. I have to admit, when your Grace mentioned she was worried about you, I was concerned. But my goodness, you're sharper than all of us put together. My quiet, determined counterattack had rewritten the story they had been told. I was no longer seen as a fragile old woman to be pitied, but as a force to be reckoned with. An even more unexpected friendship began to bloom in the most unlikely of places. A month after the sentencing, I received a letter. It was from Rachel Patterson. It was a short, tentative note, thanking me for my honesty and asking if I might be open to meeting for coffee. She wrote that her children were asking questions about their father's family, and she didn't know what to tell them. We met at a neutral, anonymous coffee shop halfway between Tacoma and Ballard. She looked tired, the stress of the past months etched around her eyes, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity. We talked for 2 hours. We didn't talk much about Derek. He was the wound we shared, but he was not the substance of our conversation. Instead, we talked about our children. We talked about the challenges of single motherhood, a reality she was now facing head-on. We talked about gardening, and books, and the difficulty of finding a reliable plumber. We were two women from different generations, whose lives had been violently collided by the same man's deceit. And in that collision, we found a strange and unexpected common ground. A friendship was born, not out of our shared trauma, but in spite of it. We were two survivors, and we recognized the strength in each other. The most complicated piece of the aftermath, of course, was Grace. After Derek's arrest, she had vanished into a cocoon of shame and grief. She didn't return my calls. She moved into a small, bleak apartment across town, and took on extra shifts as a dental hygienist, a job she'd only ever worked part-time. I knew, through Isabel, that she had started therapy, the work of untangling how she had been groomed, how her own insecurities and her desperate need for Derek's approval had allowed her to become a willing participant in such a monstrous plot, was a journey she had to take alone. Her first attempt to reconnect was a letter, which arrived about 4 months after the sentencing. It was a long, rambling, tear-stained confession. It was filled with self-recrimination and shame. She wrote about how Derek had spent years subtly undermining her confidence, isolating her from her friends, making her feel that his success was her only source of value. She acknowledged her part in the plan against me, not as an excuse, but as a statement of fact. He told me it was for your own good, she wrote. And the sickest part, Mom, is that I wanted to believe him. It was easier to believe you were losing your mind than to believe my own life was a lie. It was the first honest thing she had said in years. I didn't write back. Not yet. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too profound. Forgiveness was a country I was not yet ready to visit. But I kept the letter. Our first face-to-face meeting happened a few weeks later. She called and asked if she could come over. I agreed. When I opened the door, the woman standing on my porch was a stranger. The polished, confident wife of the successful businessman was gone. This Grace was thinner, her clothes were simpler, her face was bare of makeup, and her eyes were filled with a deep, weary sadness. She didn't try to hug me. She just stood in the hall, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. I don't expect you to forgive me, Mom, she said, her voice quiet. I needed to say I'm sorry. Not for what this did to me. For what I did to you. I betrayed you. And I have to live with that. I looked at my daughter, this broken, rebuilding woman, and I felt the first, tentative shift in the ice that had encased my heart. The rage was gone, replaced by a vast, desolate sorrow for the years we had lost, for the relationship that had been so thoroughly corrupted. I know, I said. It was all I could offer. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was a beginning. It was a crack in the wall between us, a tiny sliver of light in a very dark room. The path back to each other, if one existed at all, would be a long and difficult one. But for the first time, it seemed possible. She had taken the first, agonizing step, she had owned her own truth. The quiet aftermath, with its sentences and fragile second chances, was not an ending. It was a clearing of the wreckage, the necessary and painful work that had to be done before any new construction could begin. The true liberation wasn't in the sound of a gavel or the click of a cell door. It was in the slow, deliberate reclaiming of my own life. On my own terms. It was a renewal, not just of my finances, but of my very spirit. Jordan Ellis, ever the consummate professional, handled the final pieces of the financial puzzle with ruthless efficiency. He worked with the DA's office and the courts to untangle the web of Derek's fraud. It turned out, Derek had been skimming from my investment accounts for over a year, a series of small, cleverly disguised transfers that he had explained away as management fees or capital gains taxes. With the evidence from Dana's investigation, the court had no trouble clawing back the majority of the stolen funds. Jordan recovered not just the principal, but interest and penalties as well. But he didn't stop there. In a move that demonstrated a level of compassionate justice I would never have expected from a high-powered attorney, he petitioned the court on my behalf. We argued that a portion of the recovered assets, specifically the funds Derek had fraudulently obtained for his new business venture with Rachel, should be placed in a restitution fund. It wasn't for Rachel herself, but for her children. It was a small trust, managed by a third party, designated for their future education. They are the most innocent victims in all of this, Evelyn, he'd said to me when he proposed the idea. They shouldn't have to pay for the sins of their father. I agreed without hesitation. It wasn't an act of charity, it was an act of correction. It was a way of taking money that had been stolen out of greed and transforming it into a tool of opportunity. It was a way of ensuring that something good could rise from the ashes of so much bad faith. It was the final, definitive severing of Derek's toxic legacy from my own. My money would no longer be a weapon of deceit. It would be a promise to two children I barely knew, a quiet testament to the idea that decency could, in the end, win. With the legal battles behind me and my financial fortress secure, I found myself standing in a new and unfamiliar landscape, a future that was entirely, completely my own to design. For years, my life had been defined by my roles, wife to Bob, mother to Grace, and then, in the dark times, victim in waiting to Derek. Now, those definitions were gone. I was just Evelyn. And the question of who Evelyn was, what she wanted, what brought her joy, was a thrilling and slightly terrifying mystery. My first act of liberation was a return to the dream that had started it all. I walked into a travel agency, the same one where Bob and I had once picked up brochures, and I booked a trip. Not the Mediterranean cruise, that voyage was tainted now, a vessel of trauma rather than joy. This was something new. A 2-week, expertly guided archaeological tour of Greece. I wanted to stand in the Acropolis, to walk the grounds of Delphi, to feel the ancient stones of Crete beneath my feet. I wanted to connect with a history that was deeper and more enduring than my own small, painful story. It was a trip not of leisure, but of learning. Not an escape, but an immersion. My second act was smaller, but in its own way, more profound. I walked into the Tacoma Community College admissions office, a place where my husband had sent hundreds of high school students over the years, and I enrolled in a class, Introduction to Computer Science. For years, I had allowed Derek and Grace to manage my digital world, a dependency they had actively encouraged and ruthlessly exploited. My supposed incompetence with technology had been one of the cornerstones of their narrative of my decline. No more. I was going to learn the language of this new world. I would learn to code, to build a website, to understand the architecture of the very systems they had used against me. I was not just reclaiming my independence, I was upgrading it. And then, there was the joy. I realized how little pure, unadulterated joy I had allowed myself since Bob had passed. My life had become a series of obligations, of memories, of quiet, dutiful routines. One evening, driving past the local YMCA, I saw a banner strung across the entrance. Swing Dance Nights. Fridays at 7 p.m. All ages and skill levels, welcome. I remembered Bob and I, years ago, trying to learn in our living room, laughing as we tripped over each other's feet. On a whim, I pulled into the parking lot. I walked in, paid the $5 entry fee, and spent the next 2 hours being spun around a dance floor by a delightful assortment of strangers, a retired postal worker, a college student, a widower like myself with kind eyes and surprisingly nimble feet. I was clumsy. I was awkward. And I hadn't had that much fun in a decade. I went back the next Friday, and the Friday after that. My life began to fill with these small acts of self-possession. Coffee with Rachel, where we talked about our children and our gardens. Phone calls with Isabel, filled with easy laughter instead of coded warnings. Even the slow, tentative steps toward a new relationship with Grace. She would come over for dinner once a week. The conversations were stilted at first, navigating the minefield of our shared history. We didn't talk about Derek. We didn't talk about the betrayal. Instead, we talked about my computer class. She would tell me about a difficult patient at work. We were building something new, something fragile, on the scorched earth of what had come before. It wasn't the old, easy love of a mother and daughter. Perhaps it never would be, but it was something real. It was something honest. One quiet evening, I was sitting on my porch swing, a cup of tea growing cool in my hands, watching the last rays of the summer sun paint the clouds in shades of lavender and rose. The scent of Bob's prize-winning roses filled the air. For the first time, the scent didn't bring a pang of grief, but a gentle, quiet sense of peace. The house behind me was no longer a battlefield, no longer a prize to be defended. It was simply my home, my sanctuary. I thought about the woman I had been less than a year ago, the trusting widow, the naive mother, the frog in the slowly boiling water. It felt like a lifetime ago. I had been forced to walk through a fire I never imagined, and in doing so, I had been forged into someone new. I could finally name the arc of my own story, the terrifying, liberating journey I had been on. I had been deeply wounded, struck by a betrayal that came from the very heart of my own family. But from that wound, something else had been born. I had awakened, I had seen the truth, and instead of crumbling, I had chosen to fight. I had launched a strategic counterattack, not with rage and fury, but with cold, clear-eyed precision. And in the aftermath, in the quiet rebuilding, I had found a new state of being. I was fully self-possessed. My life was now my own, not a gift from a husband, not a legacy for a child, but a creation of my own choices, lived on my own timeline. The peace I felt was not the passive, quiet peace of resignation. It was a hard-won peace, the peace that comes only after the war is over and you are the one left standing. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first star of evening pricked the deepening twilight. I smiled. I was Evelyn Parker, and I was finally, completely, gloriously free. This story is a stark reminder that the deepest betrayals often wear the mask of love and concern. It's a testament to the quiet strength found in the face of manipulation and a call to trust your own instincts, even when those you love are telling you not to. True independence isn't just financial, it's the courage to see the truth, to reclaim your own narrative, and to build a fortress of self-respect that no amount of deceit can penetrate. It proves that it is never too late to fight for your own life and win. Now, if you liked this story, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me which part surprised you the most. Each subscription and comment from you is a great motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful things in life. Thank you very much.